When did your family choose to throw you in jail rather than communicate honestly with you? I was pinned against my kitchen counter while 2 federal officers demanded I tell them where I was kidnapping my children. My 7-year-old daughter Dolly was on the living room floor, turning blue from an asthma attack that started because Officer Delgado ripped her emergency inhaler from her hands and sealed it in an evidence bag. It started 5 days prior, when my boyfriend's sister came over to fix my laptop. She started working on it and immediately noticed the GPS trackers pinging from my kids' backpacks. I told her my ex-husband had planted them there during his last supervised visit, and my lawyer suggested leaving them as evidence. She looked at me like I was lying, and that's all it took. Monday morning at 7 a.m., I was dragging the trash bins to the curb when a police car pulled up. Officer Park and Officer Delgado identified themselves, saying they had credible intelligence that I was planning to abduct my children and violate custody agreements. Before I could even ask what they were talking about, Park said, "We need to take the children into protective custody." That's when Dolly came out, already wheezing slightly from the fear of what she heard. Stress always triggered her asthma. She was holding her emergency inhaler. Delgado immediately took it from her hand. "This needs to be tested. It could be drugs." Dolly started crying, reaching for it. "That's mine. I need it. She has severe asthma," I pleaded. "Convenient," Delgado said, sealing it in the evidence bag. "Create a medical emergency to avoid answering questions and coach your kids to act. If she really needs it, the hospital can provide one," Park added, pulling out her phone. "I'll call them now." Dolly's breathing was already getting worse, that whistling wheeze starting. "Dolly, baby, try to stay calm. Don't coach her," Park snapped, grabbing my arm. She spoke into the phone. "Yes, bringing in a 7-year-old who may need asthma medication. 20 minutes. Perfect." 20 minutes? I screamed. "She doesn't have that long." "Then you better start talking fast," Delgado said, pushing me harder against the counter. "Where are you taking the kids?" Dolly dropped to her knees, hands on her throat. The wheeze was getting quieter. "She's dying," I screamed. "Give her the inhaler." "After you tell us the truth," Park said, twisting my arm behind my back. "Your boyfriend's sister saw everything. The GPS trackers? That was for my upcoming custody battle." "Bullcrap," Delgado said, pulling out handcuffs. "You're lying." Dolly fell forward onto her hands, her lips turning gray. "Just tell us where you were meeting your ex," Park pressed, holding my wrists while Delgado started cuffing me. "Was he helping you run?" "My ex has a restraining order. He was stalking us." The first cuff clicked shut. "Or you were working together?" Delgado said. "Admit it and we'll help your daughter." "I'm not admitting to something I didn't do. She's going to die." "Stop being dramatic," he said, yanking my other arm back. "Kids don't die from asthma in 5 minutes." "Yes, they do. That's exactly how long it takes." Dolly went completely still and started twitching. "What's happening?" Delgado asked, suddenly alarmed. "She's not getting oxygen to her brain. Please, tell us the truth," Park shouted, slamming me against the counter with my hands cuffed behind me. "Where were you taking them?" "Nowhere. Give her the inhaler." Dolly was unconscious now. Delgado tried to put the inhaler in her mouth. "That won't work. She can't breathe in." "Then what do I do?" He was panicking. "Uncuff me. Let me help her." "Nice try," Park said, pushing my face against the counter. "Call 911. Park kept me pinned while dialing. "If you just confess, this all ends. We need an ambulance at 2861 Cross Lane Road." "I have nothing to confess. Tell them respiratory arrest." "She's turning blue," Park said into the phone. "How far out?" 4 minutes, the dispatcher said. 4 minutes to tell us the truth," Delgado said, grabbing my hair and pulling my head back. "That's all you have. She'll be dead in 4 minutes." That's when my son walked in and saw Dolly. "What did you do to her?" "Get the boy," Park told Delgado. "No," my son fought him. "Dolly, Mom, why are you handcuffed?" "See how you're traumatizing your son?" Park said, pressing her knee into my back. "Just confess." "I didn't do anything. She's dying because you took her medicine." Through the window, neighbors were gathering. The ambulance siren was getting closer. Dolly's chest was completely still. "Last chance," Park said, yanking the cuffs up until I screamed. "Tell us where you were going to meet your accomplice." When the EMTs burst through the door, one immediately started bagging Dolly while I was still cuffed against the counter. "How long has she been down?" the EMT asked. "At least 5 minutes," I sobbed. "They took her inhaler during an attack." The EMT looked at them, then at me in handcuffs. "You took her rescue inhaler during an active asthma attack?" "We were interrogating a suspect," Delgado started. "You imbeciles," the EMT muttered. "She's in full respiratory arrest. Uncuff the mother. Now. She's a flight risk. Uncuff her now or I'm reporting this." As they finally released me and loaded Dolly onto the stretcher, Park leaned close. "This isn't over. We know what you were planning." My daughter's face was blue. Her body was limp. She still wasn't breathing on her own. The EMT was squeezing the bag every few seconds while they lifted the stretcher and I scrambled up behind them into the ambulance. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grab the rail, but I pulled myself in and dropped onto the bench beside Dolly's stretcher. The EMT kept pumping air into her lungs while checking her pulse, and I reached over to touch her hair, whispering that Mommy was right here even though she couldn't hear me. Through the back doors I could see my son standing in our driveway with tears running down his face, and our neighbor Mrs. Lynn already hurrying over to him. The doors slammed shut and the ambulance lurched forward with the siren screaming. The EMT looked at me while still bagging Dolly and said her airways were really tight and we needed to get there fast. His partner was driving like crazy, taking corners so sharp I had to grab the rail to keep from falling. Dolly's face was still that awful gray-blue color, and her chest only moved when he squeezed the bag. We hit the hospital in maybe 4 minutes and they already had people waiting outside. The second we stopped, the doors flew open and 3 nurses were pulling the stretcher out while the EMT kept bagging. I jumped down and ran after them through the automatic doors into this huge bright room where everything went crazy all at once. They lifted Dolly onto a bed and suddenly there were people everywhere. One nurse cutting off her shirt while another stuck needles in her arm. The doctor was shouting orders about intubation and medications I didn't understand. Someone shoved a clipboard at me with consent forms and my hand was shaking, so bad I could barely sign my name. The doctor leaned over and said they were starting steroids and albuterol right away, but if she didn't respond, they'd have to put a tube down her throat. I just nodded and kept signing wherever they pointed. That's when I heard Park's voice behind me demanding to come in. The security guard at the door was blocking blocking her, this big guy who wasn't moving an inch. Park kept saying she needed to continue her investigation, but the guard told her this was a medical emergency, and she had to wait outside. She tried to push past him, but he put his hand up and said if she didn't leave the treatment area, he'd call the police, which was weird since she was police. Park started yelling about obstruction, but the guard just stood there like a wall. The head of security showed up and told Park she could wait in the lobby or leave the hospital, but she wasn't getting near us until the child was stable. Park finally backed off, but I could see her through the glass doors, pacing and talking on her phone. A woman in a suit came up to me while the nurses were still working on Dolly. She said she was from the hospital social services and needed to talk to me about a report the officers filed. My stomach dropped when she said CPS had been notified about possible child endangerment and kidnapping plans. She handed me this packet of papers about my rights and said a CPS investigator would probably show up in a few hours, but for now, I could stay with Dolly. I wanted to scream that this was insane, but I just took the papers and shoved them in my pocket. I pulled out my phone and called Mrs. Lynn, begging her to keep my son because I couldn't leave Dolly. She said of course and told me she saw the whole thing through her window and couldn't believe what those cops did to us. My son got on the phone crying that he wanted to come to the hospital, but I told him Dolly needed me here and Mrs. Lynn would take good care of him. He kept asking if Dolly was going to die and I lied and said she'd be fine. After I hung up, another woman appeared with more paperwork, saying she was from risk management and needed to document what happened before we arrived. She had me sign releases for Dolly's medical records while she took notes about the inhaler being taken and how long Dolly went without treatment. Her face stayed blank, but I saw her eyebrows go up when I told her about them keeping me cuffed while Dolly was dying. She wrote everything down and said someone would be in touch. The EMT who brought us in came back to check on us and pulled me aside. He handed me his business card and said real quiet that he was filing an adverse incident report about the officers interfering with emergency medical care. He told me to have my lawyer call him because what they did was completely wrong and he'd testify if needed. Before he left, he looked at Dolly and said she was tough and would pull through. 2 hours crawled by with nurses constantly checking monitors and adjusting medications. The respiratory therapist explained they were checking her blood gases every hour and had intubation stuff ready if she crashed again. Dolly was breathing on her own now, but they had her sedated so she wouldn't fight the oxygen mask. I held her little hand and watched her chest go up and down, counting every breath. Through the glass doors, I could see Park and Delgado in the hallway talking to some guy in a suit who had to be their boss. I heard bits of Park saying something about following protocol and credible intelligence. When Park saw me looking, she turned away fast. The supervisor guy looked at me for a second with this expression I couldn't read. A nurse came over and told me CPS had called and an investigator would be here by 2 p.m. and I had to be available for the interview. My chest got tight thinking about having to talk to CPS while Dolly was lying here hooked up to machines, but I knew refusing would make everything worse. I texted my lawyer asking if he knew anyone who handled CPS cases because I needed help fast. My phone buzzed almost right away with a text from my lawyer sending me Tristan Nguyen's number and saying he was the best civil rights attorney for police misconduct in the state. I stepped into the hallway outside Dolly's room and dialed with shaking fingers. Tristan answered on the second ring, and when I started explaining everything in a rush, he stopped me and said, "Don't talk to anyone about this without him present. Not CPS, not the police, nobody." He said he could be there in an hour and to just sit tight and document everything I could remember. His voice was calm and steady, and for the first time since this morning, I felt like maybe someone actually knew what to do. 10 minutes later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, a woman identified herself as the CPS intake worker, needing to clarify the allegation. She started reading from her screen about a suspected kidnapping plan based on GPS devices found, and then she said something that made my blood run cold, that I had coached a medical episode to avoid questioning. I actually gasped out loud and said they were claiming I triggered my daughter's asthma attack on purpose. The worker said she was just reading what Officer Park had reported, and the investigator would determine the facts during the interview. After I hung up, I sat back down next to Dolly's bed and opened the notes app on my phone, forcing myself to type out everything from the moment the officers showed up at 7 a.m. My fingers were shaking so bad I kept hitting wrong letters, but I made myself include every detail. How Delgado took the inhaler, how Park kept me pinned while Dolly was dying, how they refused to give it back even when she was turning blue. I typed for 20 minutes straight, creating this timeline that showed exactly how long they kept her medicine away while she couldn't breathe. When I finished, I emailed it to myself and to Tristan's email that my lawyer had included, knowing this record might be the only proof of what really happened. The attending physician came in while I was typing and said Dolly was stable enough to move to the pediatric ICU for continued monitoring. She said the immediate danger had passed, but Dolly would need to stay at least 48 hours for observation. 2 orderlies came in and started unhooking monitors to transfer everything to a rolling setup, and I stood up fast and grabbed Dolly's hand, telling them I was coming with her. Nobody argued with me as we went through the hospital corridors to the PICU, me walking right beside the bed, refusing to let go of her little hand. Once we got her settled in the new room with all the monitors hooked back up, my phone buzzed with an email notification that made my stomach drop. My ex-husband's attorney had filed an emergency motion for temporary custody based on today's incident, claiming I was unstable and had put our daughter at risk by refusing to cooperate with federal officers. The rage that went through me was so strong I had to sit down, but I immediately forwarded it to Tristan without even reading the rest. Not even an hour later, Tristan called to tell me the court had already scheduled an emergency hearing in 48 hours to address the custody motion. He said he was already preparing our response and would argue that my ex had orchestrated this whole thing by planting those GPS trackers during his supervised visit. He said we'd need the EMT's testimony about the officers taking the inhaler and any witness statements we could get from neighbors who saw what happened. The hospital social worker came back with a stack of forms about Dolly's medical history and our support network, sitting down with her clipboard ready to take notes. I carefully explained about the restraining order against my ex, how he'd been stalking us for months, and how those GPS trackers had been planted granted during his last supervised visit 2 weeks ago. I told her my lawyer had said to leave them as evidence for our upcoming custody battle. She wrote everything down without any expression on her face, but she was listening close and asked follow-up questions about the stalking incidents. About 45 minutes later, Tristan walked through the door carrying a briefcase and immediately took charge of the whole situation. He pulled out his phone and started taking pictures of Dolly hooked up to all the machines, then sat down with my timeline and went through it line by line, asking me specific questions about exact times and who said what. He explained our legal strategy for fighting both the CPS investigation and the emergency custody hearing, saying we had a strong case for police misconduct and that my ex's involvement with the GPS trackers would work in our favor. Just having him there being so confident and organized made me feel like I could actually fight this instead of just drowning in it. While we were talking, my phone lit up with a text from Jeff Presley saying he had video from his security camera that showed part of what happened through our front window. He said he'd already saved the footage to his computer and could send it to my attorney right away, that it clearly showed the officers holding me down while Dolly was on the floor. This could be exactly what we needed to prove what really happened instead of whatever story Park and Delgado were telling. The CPS investigator called Tristan's phone since I'd told the intake worker he was representing me, and she wanted to schedule a home visit for tomorrow morning. Tristan told her that wouldn't work because we had the emergency custody hearing at the same time, and after some back and forth where I could hear her getting annoyed through the phone, she agreed to do the home visit after court instead. My phone buzzed with a voicemail while I was watching Dolly's oxygen levels on the monitor, and when I played it back, Detective Mateo Rogers from Internal Affairs said he needed my statement about what happened with Officers Park and Delgado. I immediately forwarded it to Tristan, who called back within minutes telling me this was actually good news because it meant they were looking into the officers' conduct, and we'd send our statement through him to control exactly what information they got. About an hour later, my boyfriend rushed through the door looking stressed, and before I could even tell him about Dolly's condition, he said his sister Aubrey was still insisting she did the right thing by calling the cops about those GPS trackers. He said she wouldn't back down even after hearing Dolly almost died, kept saying she was just protecting the kids and his whole family was taking her side, which meant he was getting pressure from everyone to break up with me. The betrayal hit me hard, seeing him standing there torn between supporting us and keeping peace with his family, and I could tell from his face he was already pulling away, even though he kept saying he'd figure something out. That evening while Dolly slept, I sat in the corner of her room with my laptop pulling together every piece of evidence I had, taking screenshots of all my ex's threatening texts from the past 6 months, scanning the restraining order paperwork, and downloading the GPS tracker logs that showed they'd been moving between my ex's apartment and our house. I organized everything into folders labeled by date and sent it all to Tristan, who reviewed it within the hour and said this was exactly what we needed to prove my ex was behind this whole thing, not some kidnapping plan I'd made up. The next morning, Dr. Naomi Anderson, the pediatric pulmonologist, came to examine Dolly and spent 40 minutes checking her breathing and reviewing her chart before sitting down to write an official statement confirming this was absolutely a life-threatening asthma attack that would have been fatal without immediate treatment. She wrote that taking a rescue inhaler from a child during an active attack showed complete disregard for basic medical necessity, and she'd testify to that in court if needed. I was taking a picture of her statement for our records when my phone rang with a blocked number, and when I answered, my ex-husband's voice came through saying he was going to get full custody now that I'd shown everyone what kind of mother I really was. I quickly put him on speaker and started recording while he went on about how the cops finally saw through my lies and admitted he knew about those GPS trackers because he needed to keep tabs on his kids since I was so unstable. The recording captured everything, including him saying he didn't care about the restraining order because soon the kids would be living with him anyway, and when I sent it to Tristan, he immediately said this violation was huge for our case. 2 days later, the CPS investigator showed up at our house with Tristan already there, and she walked through every room taking pictures and notes about where we kept medications, checking the kids' bedrooms, looking in the fridge, and asking about our daily routines. She wrote down that I'd been uncooperative with law enforcement during their investigation, but Tristan made sure she also documented that this happened during a medical emergency where my daughter's life was at risk, and she seemed to accept that context even if she stayed neutral about everything else. That same evening, I was making dinner when my neighbor texted me that Channel 7 was running a story about our incident, and when I turned it on, they were using anonymous law enforcement sources to describe me as a dangerous parent who coached her child to fake a medical emergency to avoid arrest. My phone started blowing up with texts from people who'd seen it, some supportive but others asking if it was true, and the shame of having our private nightmare turned into public entertainment made me want to disappear. Tristan moved fast the next morning, filing emergency motions with the court to preserve all the 911 recordings, any body cam footage from the Park and Delgado, and the hospital's security camera videos before anything could mysteriously disappear, like he said often happened in cases against cops. The judge granted our preservation order that same afternoon, which meant the department had to keep everything, though. When we formally requested the body cam footage 3 days later, they denied it, saying it was part of an ongoing investigation and couldn't be released to anyone, including us. Tristan wasn't surprised and immediately filed a formal demand through the court, explaining we needed that footage for the custody hearing, warning me it could take weeks of legal fighting, but we'd eventually get it because judges don't like evidence being hidden. While we waited, I spent hours writing out a detailed statement about everything that happened, focusing only on facts like Tristan said, describing how they took the inhaler, how long they delayed medical care, how they refused to help even when Dolly stopped breathing, making sure every word was careful and specific so they couldn't twist anything against us later. That night, my boyfriend showed up at the hospital looking exhausted and pulled me into the hallway while the nurse watched Dolly. He kept rubbing his face and wouldn't meet my eyes as he explained his family was having a huge fight about what happened. His mom thought his sister did the right thing by calling the cops, but his dad was furious that she almost killed a little girl. He grabbed my hands and promised he wasn't going going anywhere, but then admitted he couldn't publicly say his sister was wrong because it would destroy his family. I felt my stomach drop as I realized I'd be fighting this alone without his full support. The next morning, my phone rang while I was dozing in the hospital chair, and it was my manager asking where I'd been for 3 days. I explained about Dolly being in the ICU, and she got quiet before warning me that without proper documentation, my job was at risk. She emailed me FMLA paperwork that had to be filed within 15 days and reminded me I'd already used most of my sick time. I filled it out right there on my phone while watching Dolly's oxygen numbers, knowing I couldn't afford to lose my health insurance on top of everything else. Around 3 a.m., my neighbor texted that my son was having nightmares and crying for me, so I rushed home to find him curled up in my bed shaking. He kept asking if the police were going to take him away, and nothing I said could calm him down. I held him while he sobbed and promised to call the school counselor first thing in the morning because this was bigger than what I could handle alone. When I got back to the hospital, my phone was blowing up with notifications because someone had posted Jeff's security camera footage online. The video showed me pinned against the counter, while Dolly collapsed in the background and already had thousands of shares. People were commenting things like, "Those cops should be in jail," and "That poor baby," and suddenly our private nightmare was everywhere. Detective Rogers called Tristan that afternoon saying he'd interviewed the EMT who confirmed Dolly was in full respiratory arrest when he arrived. The EMT had written in his official report that the officers had taken her rescue medication during an active asthma attack and refused to return it. Rogers told Tristan he'd been doing this job for 20 years and had never seen anything like it. 2 days later, the doctor finally said Dolly was ready to come off the ventilator, and I held my breath as they removed the tube. She coughed and gasped, but then started breathing on her own while I cried with relief. She looked confused and scared, so I explained she'd had a bad asthma attack, but she was safe now in the hospital. Her voice was raspy, but the first thing she asked was where her brother was. The CPS investigator visited that same day and sat down with me and Tristan to discuss their findings. She said Dr. Anderson's statement about Dolly's medical condition carried a lot of weight, and they were leaning toward a safety plan instead of removal. This meant I'd have to follow certain requirements and check in regularly, but Dolly could come home with me. It wasn't perfect, but compared to losing my kids, it felt like winning the lottery. The emergency custody hearing happened the next morning, and I sat there watching my ex-husband try to look concerned about the kids he'd been stalking. The judge pulled up his file and read through the restraining order violations, then looked at him over her glasses. She warned him that any more contact outside the supervised visits would result in immediate arrest. When his lawyer tried to argue about the GPS trackers being for safety, the judge cut him off and said stalking wasn't parenting. She deferred the custody motion for 30 days pending more evidence, but made it clear she wasn't impressed with his sudden concern. That afternoon, Tristan got a copy of Officer Park's official report and called me immediately because something was wrong with it. She'd written that I was coaching the child to display distress and refused to cooperate with lawful orders about the kidnapping plan. But the timestamp showed she'd filed it at 11:47 a.m. when Dolly had already been in the hospital for over 4 hours. Tristan said this kind of discrepancy was exactly what we needed to show they were covering up what really happened. The next day, a lawyer representing Officer Delgado's union called Tristan, suggesting we should discuss a potential resolution before things went further. He kept using words like unfortunate misunderstanding and regrettable incident, which made me want to scream. Tristan put him on speaker, so I could hear him dance around admitting fault while clearly trying to make this go away. We agreed to listen to their offer, but Tristan warned me not to get my hopes up because the first offer was always insulting. 2 days later, Tristan called me into his office and spread out a bunch of papers on his desk. He pointed to different documents while explaining his strategy for handling everything. The custody hearing had to come first because keeping my kids safe was the most important thing. He showed me how winning that case would make our position stronger when we went after the city for what the officers did. His finger traced through the timeline he'd created, marking each court date and deadline we needed to hit. I nodded and signed where he pointed, trusting his experience with these kinds of cases. The next morning, we walked into the courthouse for the emergency custody hearing, and I saw my ex sitting at the other table looking all concerned. His lawyer stood up and started talking about the kidnapping allegations, but the judge cut him off and pulled up my ex's file on her computer. She read through all his restraining order violations while adjusting her glasses and looking over at him with this expression that made him squirm in his seat. When his lawyer tried to argue about the GPS trackers being for the kids' safety, the judge held up her hand and said stalking wasn't the same as parenting. She looked through more papers and then announced she was keeping custody exactly how it was, because there wasn't any real evidence of kidnapping plans. The full hearing would happen in 30 days, but she wasn't going to disrupt the kids' lives based on accusations that didn't have proof. My legs went weak with relief and tears started running down my face as I grabbed Tristan's arm to steady myself. That afternoon, my phone started blowing up with notifications about a GoFundMe page that Jeff had created without even asking me. The title said something about helping a family terrorized by police and already had over $2,000 in donations. I felt weird about taking charity from strangers, but when I read the comments from people who'd seen the video and wanted to help, my chest got tight with emotion. Jeff texted me that he knew I was proud, but medical bills were expensive and good lawyers cost money, so just let people help. The money kept coming in all day from people I'd never met who were angry about what happened to Dolly. 3 days later, the hospital discharge team came to teach me about using Dolly's inhaler with this plastic tube thing called a spacer. The respiratory therapist showed me how to shake the inhaler and attach it to the spacer, then had me practice the whole routine 5 times. They gave me this thick folder with an asthma action plan that had green, yellow, and red zones for different symptoms. The social worker emphasized that stress was a major trigger for asthma attacks, and strongly recommended we find a counselor who worked with kids who'd been through trauma. I left the hospital carrying the folder and a bag full of extra spacers and peak flow meters, feeling overwhelmed by all the follow-up appointments they'd scheduled. That evening, my boyfriend came home looking exhausted and told me he'd finally confronted his sister about what she'd done. Aubrey had refused to admit admit she'd done anything wrong and kept insisting she was just trying to protect the kids. The argument got so bad that other family members got involved, with some taking her side and others being horrified that she'd nearly caused Dolly's death. He sat on the couch with his head in his hands, saying his mom was crying and his dad was yelling and the whole family was falling apart over this. I could see how much it was wearing on him, being stuck between supporting us and not wanting to lose his family. The next week, Tristan filed a formal notice of claim with the city and police department, which he explained was the first step in suing them. The document listed all the civil rights violations and the gross negligence of taking away life-saving medication during a medical emergency. This started a 60-day clock where the city had to respond to our claims before we could file an actual lawsuit. He made copies of everything and sent them by certified mail so we'd have proof they received it. A few days after that, Detective Rogers called Tristan to say Internal Affairs had gotten Jeff's security footage and was comparing it to what the officers wrote in their reports. He couldn't share specific details because of the ongoing investigation, but he mentioned there were significant discrepancies between what the video showed and what the officers claimed happened. Tristan put him on speaker so I could hear him say we should be patient because these investigations took time, but something was definitely being looked at seriously. The following Monday, I found out Officer Park had been placed on desk duty while the investigation continued, but Delgado was still out on patrol like nothing happened. It made me so mad that they weren't treating them the same, but Tristan explained that Park was the senior officer and had been more aggressive during the incident. At least it was something, even though it didn't feel like nearly enough punishment for what they'd done. That same week, CPS sent me a letter with a list of requirements I had to complete to close their case. They wanted me to take a 12-week parenting class and maintain detailed documentation of Dolly's medication schedule and medical appointments. The requirements felt like a slap in the face since I'd always managed her asthma perfectly until the officers took her inhaler away, but I signed up for the class anyway and created a binder to track every dose of medication and every doctor visit because I couldn't risk giving them any reason to keep the case open. 2 weeks later, the school called to say someone had reported seeing my ex parked across the street during dismissal time. The security guard had approached his car and he'd driven away, but not before several teachers saw him sitting there watching the playground. I immediately called the police to report the restraining order violation, and then called the school to make sure they had updated photos of him. When the officer came to take my report, my ex claimed he was just driving through the neighborhood and hadn't meant to be near the school. The officer documented it but said without proof he was specifically there to see the kids, it would be hard to prove a violation. 3 weeks passed before Tristan called with news from the district attorney's office, and I could tell from his voice it wasn't good. He explained they'd reviewed everything but decided there wasn't enough evidence of criminal intent to charge the officers, which meant Park and Delgado wouldn't face any criminal consequences for what they did to Dolly. The anger hit me so hard I had to sit down on my kitchen floor while he talked about how civil court was still our best option for getting some kind of accountability. I went back to work the next Monday with FMLA paperwork that let me leave for Dolly's appointments without getting fired. My manager had already heard about what happened from the news coverage and told me to take whatever time I needed. The other people in my department kept bringing me coffee and asking if I needed anything, but I could barely focus on the computer screen most days. Every spreadsheet reminded me of the mounting medical bills, and I'd find myself staring at nothing for minutes at a time before someone would gently ask if I was okay. That first week back, my son started doing things that scared me more than any custody threat. He'd get up 3 or 4 times every night to check all the locks, then come to my room to make sure I was still there. One night, I found him pushing our heavy dresser against his bedroom door because he was convinced someone was coming to take us away. I started letting him sleep on the floor next to my bed with extra blankets and pillows, and we created a whole routine where we'd check the locks together before bed. His therapist said it was normal after trauma, but watching my brave boy turn into someone who jumped at every car door slamming outside broke something inside me. The school called a meeting about Dolly's 504 plan 2 days after I got back to work. The principal, her teacher, the school nurse, and 2 other administrators sat around a big table while I explained exactly what had happened with her inhaler. They'd gotten Dr. Anderson's letter about her severe asthma and the life-threatening nature of any delays in treatment. The nurse promised to keep an inhaler in her office plus one in Dolly's classroom, and they wrote up a whole emergency protocol with my phone number at the top. Her teacher actually teared up when she said she couldn't imagine what we'd been through. After another 2 weeks of legal battles, the court finally ordered the release of some body cam footage for our custody case. Tristan warned me most of it would be blacked out for various reasons, but when we watched it in his office, you could still see enough. The video showed Park pinning me against the counter while behind us, slightly out of focus. You could see Dolly on the floor not moving. You could hear me screaming about her dying, and you could see Park yanking my arms back harder. Tristan paused it at the part where Dolly was clearly unconscious and said this would help our case significantly, even with all the redactions. A journalist named Sarah Lynn contacted Jeff after seeing his social media posts about the incident. She interviewed him for over an hour about what he saw through his window, then called me to get my side of the story. Her article came out 3 days later with a much more balanced view than the earlier coverage, including quotes from the EMT's report and Jeff's description of watching Dolly collapse. The online comments started shifting, with more people supporting us, though there were still plenty defending the officers and saying I should have just cooperated. I learned to stop reading them after someone said Dolly deserved what happened for having a criminal mother. My boyfriend came over on a Friday night after the kids were asleep, and I knew from his face what was coming. His family had been pressuring him since the incident, with his sister Aubrey refusing to admit she'd been wrong and his parents taking her side. He said he couldn't handle being stuck between us anymore, and thought it would be better if we just stayed friends. I was too exhausted to cry or argue, just nodded and said I understood. He promised to still be there for the kids, but we both knew things would never be the same. The city's legal department contacted Tristan the following week with their first settlement offer. They wanted to pay $30,000 for me to sign an NDA and agree not to pursue further legal action. Tristan actually laughed when he told me the amount, saying we could get 10 times that at trial based on Dolly's medical bills alone. But he also warned me that trials could take years and would mean reliving everything over and over in court. I told him I needed time to think about whether I had the strength for a long fight or if I just needed this to end so we could try to heal. We spent the entire next week preparing for the evidentiary hearing that would determine if my ex would get any custody back. Tristan set up a mock courtroom in his conference room and had his paralegal play my ex's attorney while he coached me through answers. She grilled me about why I didn't immediately tell the officers about the GPS trackers, why I didn't just cooperate, whether I'd coached Dolly to have an asthma attack. Each practice session left me shaking, but Tristan said it was better to break down in his office than in front of the judge. The morning of the hearing, I threw up twice before leaving the house. In the courtroom, I sat in the witness chair for 3 straight hours, answering questions about everything from the GPS trackers to the restraining order history. My ex's attorney kept trying to make it sound like I was an unfit mother who'd rather let her child die than answer simple questions. During Tristan's redirect, he had me walk through exactly what happened when they took Dolly's inhaler and how many times I'd begged them to give it back. The judge leaned forward when I described Dolly turning blue and asked several pointed questions about the officer's response to her medical emergency. When the judge finally spoke after what felt like forever, his voice was firm and clear. He said he found no evidence of any kidnapping plot and that the GPS trackers were clearly planted by my ex during his supervised visit. He maintained my primary custody, ordered my ex to stick to supervised visits only, and told him he had to help pay for Dolly's medical bills from this whole mess. The CPS case would stay open for 60 more days of monitoring, but the immediate danger was over. That night, I held both my kids so tight they complained I was squishing them, but I didn't care. 3 days later, Tristan called with news that the city had increased their settlement offer to $75,000 and agreed to implement new training for officers on medical emergencies. It wasn't the accountability I wanted, since nobody would be fired or face real consequences. Tristan said it was probably the best we'd get without spending years in court fighting them. I thought about Dolly's therapy bills and the time off work I'd need and knew he was right. The next week, I sat in Tristan's office signing the settlement papers with mixed feelings churning in my stomach. The money would cover medical bills, my lost wages, and therapy for both kids, but the NDA meant I couldn't fully tell our story anywhere public. At least my children were safe and we could start moving forward. We settled into a new routine where Dolly took controller medications every single night without fail and carried 2 inhalers everywhere she went. The therapy waitlist was 3 months long, but we found a counselor who could see her every other week. She still had panic attacks sometimes, but they were getting less frequent, and that gave me hope. My son started sleeping through the night again more often, though sirens still made him bolt upright and run to check on his sister. We practiced breathing exercises together and celebrated the nights without nightmares, even though progress wasn't a straight line. 2 months later, I sat in the CPS office for our final meeting after completing all their requirements and having multiple home visits that showed a stable environment. The caseworker actually admitted off the record that the case should never have gone this far, based on what really happened. Walking out of their office felt like coming up from underwater after holding my breath for months. I spent the next weekend installing new security cameras around the house and better locks on all the doors, keeping detailed records of everything involving the children. We started talking about maybe moving somewhere fresh where the trauma didn't live in every corner of our house. For now, we were taking it one day at a time, and that had to be enough. Tonight, both kids are asleep in their beds, breathing steady and calm without any distress. I stand in their doorway listening to those precious sounds of air moving in and out of their lungs. We survived something that could have destroyed us completely. We're scarred and changed, but we're still standing and still together. That has to be enough for now because it's all we have. Well, that's the grand finale, anticlimactic as it might be. If you're still here, either you're dedicated or just really bored. Either way, you've proven your loyalty. Go on, subscribe, and let's make it official.